As a PhD student, I have seen a lot of graphs, but this is the one that made me lose my faith in humanity. In this video, we're going to unpack exactly what this graph says and what it means. But a word of caution, it's a little bit polarizing, so you might agree with me or you might have the total opposite perspective, and I'm really curious to see where you land. My name's Sydney Sauer. I'm a PhD student in sociology at Harvard University, and I make videos that share the really interesting things I'm learning in my PhD with you. All right, so about this graph. It's really very simple. The first line is GDP per capita in the United States. And if your high school econ is a little bit rusty, that just refers to basically the entire economic value of what we create as a country, or our output, divided by the population to basically get an indicator of how much economic value is created per person in the country, of course, on average. You can see that since the end of World War II, it's been steadily increasing, which is a good thing, right? That means we're being more productive and we're creating more value as a nation. It went up from about 25,000 in 1947 to over 65,000 by 2020. And by the way, all these numbers are adjusted for inflation, so you don't have to worry about what dollars meant back then versus what they mean now. The bottom line is Americans are creating more and we're getting richer. And that should be pretty obvious that we're richer than we were back in 1947. The second line is where things get interesting, really interesting. This line shows the median real family income, which basically means if you lined everybody up in America from rich to poor, what family would be right in the middle? Very, very normal, representative American family. Now at first, all the way up through the 1980s, this family income tracks right along with GDP per capita, which makes sense, right? We're creating more as a nation, creating more value, and that's because people are working. Real people are doing that. It's not coming out of nowhere, so it's reflected in their wages. But then around the 1980s, something starts to happen, and this is what social scientists call the Great Decoupling. At this point, the two lines, GDP per capita and real family income, start to grow apart. There starts to be a gap between the economic value that we as a society are producing and what people who are actually doing that work are getting paid. In other words, less of the value of what Americans are creating are coming back to the middle class average family, at least in the form of wages. So what happened? It turns out that's a really, really hard question to answer. And if you ask economists, sociologists, political scientists, everyone's going to give you a different answer. But one thing that most people can agree on is that there's been a cultural shift in how businesses operate. Before the 1980s, being a successful business was tied to the well-being of your employees. So thinking about things like pensions or healthcare insurance, these were all things that businesses used to really focus on providing to their employees. And you can think about it if your grandparents, if you're my age, might have a pension, versus the chance that someone our age is going to have a pension is a lot lower. Starting in the 1980s and the 1990s, there was a shift in how companies sort of saw profit and what their purpose was. And instead of trying to provide for their employees or provide things like pensions or other benefits, there was a shift towards what's called the shareholder value movement, which in essence means trying to create value in the stock price so that people who have shares in the companies, your investors and your stakeholders, are going to reap the benefits of that. Control over companies also shifted away from a growing class of managers, people who were directly involved with the day-to-day workers, and towards things like boards, investors, shareholders, and votes from people who are not as connected to the day-to-day process of creating that value. All of this means that everyday workers and families aren't seeing the returns of their labor, but investors are. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this video that this graph is pretty polarizing. So let me tell you both sides of the story, and you can let me know in the comments where you land. Let's start with the bad news. The Great Decoupling shows that despite the enormous economic advances that has been brought in the last 50 years, we're producing so much more value than ever, but very few of us actually reap the returns of that value we're creating. What really gets me about this graph is that it shows it doesn't have to be this way. It shows that there was a time when what people were producing and how they were being compensated for that work was tightly linked, tightly coupled. And now things just aren't the same, and we really see that in our society. But that's also where the good news comes in. Because if this was created by humans, then that means there could be things that we could do to change it. Maybe it's possible to get back to the way things were when companies cared about providing for their employees instead of laying them off to create profits for distant investors. But that really is an open question, and it's one that economists and sociologists and other types of social scientists are actively working to answer. And we're watching it play out in real time as countries around the world try to develop different systems that cope with the fact that capitalism creates so much abundance, yet it's distributed so unequally. If you enjoy thinking about these types of open questions about how society is and how it should be, then check out this next video. My whole channel is dedicated to explaining insights from social science that can help you understand the world better and also grapple with these big questions about how things are. So I'll see you next time.